Tonight we are dealing with Egyptian myths as they relate to the afterlife of man. So we must clarify not only our knowledge or lack of knowledge of the Egyptian life way, we must also clarify the different positions and convictions held within Egypt itself during a long period of its history. We cannot say, for example, that the Egyptian believed this or that. At different times, the Egyptians believed both this and that, and several other things. A people developing a culture over a period of nearly 5,000 years passed through innumerable phases and moved from one cultural platform or level to another. Therefore, during the long course of Egyptian religion, nearly every belief known to man today was contemplated and considered. Some of these beliefs never came to flowering. Others mingled in strange chemistries to produce effects we would consider fantastic. Still others moved inevitably toward philosophy and ultimately to science. Thus we have among Egyptian remains evidences of nearly every phase of mortal thinking, from theism through polytheism to monotheism to atheism. It is impossible, therefore, to make some broad statement as to the way the Egyptian regarded his destiny in the universe. We only know with reasonable certainty that in addition to the development of indigenous beliefs within the structure of Egyptian society, Egypt was bounded by several other countries and also by other advanced cultures which variously contributed and modified Egyptian thought. We know the effect of the great dynasties of Ethiopian kings upon Egyptian learning. We know also the impact of Semitic thought from the valley of the Euphrates. We cannot fail to recognize the late appearance of Greek modification. All of these and other forces, some of them probably coming from far Asia, influenced the gradual development of Egyptian religion. Egypt, as the cradle of Mediterranean civilization, also exercised in its own turn a powerful influence upon later cultural patterns. A great part of Mediterranean culture, including arts, philosophies, religions, and sciences, a great part was modified or changed by Egyptian culture. And we can trace Egyptian elements in nearly all religions in the region, including Christianity. Thus, Egypt assumes a very important position in our thinking. And we must try to understand something of the experience through which the Egyptian passed in the development of its culture. Several Egyptologists insist that early Egypt was unaware of any monotheistic teaching, unless we assume such teachings to have been achieved in the nome of Heliopolis. Actually, there is much to indicate that the early Egyptian did contemplate the possibility of one divine being at the root of life. This certainly did have its day of recognition during the reign of Amenhotep IV, whom we know as Akhenaten. This pharaoh was a complete monotheist. But of course, this is attributed in part to the Semitic blood in his family. The Egyptian, we know, was early concerned with the state of himself after death. To study his art and the psychological impact of his numerous and diversified achievements is to come to one conclusion about which there seems to be no difference of opinion. The Egyptian loved life. He was not a person burdened with nostalgia or remorse. Even though in many periods he must have had a difficult time, his country was riddled with wars, his leadership was frequently inadequate. But above all, and in spite of all, he loved life. From the beginning, then, death was approached with a rather strange attitude. Death to the Egyptian was not a release from anything. He did not look forward to a blessed state in the world beyond. In the same spirit, death was not a reward for anything, because punishments and rewards were familiar to him, and he accepted them as part of his natural existence. We are not surprised, therefore, to find that there is no concept of heaven as we understand it, or conviction of hell as we fear it in Egyptian religion. The Egyptian realized that the individual had to depart from this world. Naturally and inevitably, the Egyptian also believed and required the belief that death was not the end of human experience. It seemed much easier, even to the early Egyptian, to assume that death was merely a separation of a being from a body. The body returned to the earth, or perhaps later was magnificently embalmed and placed in a gaily ornamented sarcophagus. The Egyptian was convinced that the soul within the body lived on. He did not believe that death represented any essential change in the nature, temperament, disposition of the person. It was a change of place only, not a change of essential state. It never occurred to him that death would transform the living into superior beings or inferior beings. He was not, therefore, inclined actually to worship the dead, because it would be like simply worshiping some relative whose limitations we already recognize. This might seem to vary somewhat from the phenomenal facts available, but we must remember that the deification process in Egypt, like that in China, and essentially like that in ancient Japan prior to the rise of a comparatively recent efflorescence in Shintoism, that this deification of the dead was restricted to the ruler, inasmuch as Egypt was a theocracy. In Egypt, the king, or Pharaoh, was a god, was the embodiment of God, was the instrument of God in this world. He was the extension of the divine power into the human state. But early the Egyptian made another discovery, which affected him considerably in his psychology of life. He realized that the Pharaoh as a symbol and the Pharaoh as a person, these were two distinctly different things. Pharaoh as a symbol, as a concept, was divine. But Pharaoh as a person was not always adequate, not always sufficient to his own divine responsibility. Thus Pharaoh was an immortal mortal. He had divine attributes, and the concept was worthy of veneration and worship. But the Egyptian was too much of a realist to ignore the little man under the concept, to ignore the fallibility of the human being. In his religious art, therefore, even the great monumental productions of the state, Pharaoh must also ask for forgiveness. And like the Emperor of China, he must seek with the same humility as his people the presence of the great gods. Pharaoh was required to be an initiate of the state mysteries. And if he was unable to meet the requirements of these mysteries, he could not rule. Pharaoh in Egypt was a term which could be either male, female, or both. The Egyptian descent of royalty was essentially matriarchal. The descent was measured from the mother's side and not the father. Very often, brother and sister ruled together, therefore, as Pharaoh. And under such conditions, they were regarded as the visible divisions of an undivided, invisible power. Also, amazingly enough, if Pharaoh was a woman, she must wear not only male, but female attributes. And if Pharaoh was a man, he must also wear both male and female attributes. This is not uncommon in theocracies or divine states of government. The same is true in Tibet. The same was true in the rise of the Christian hierarchy, as the bishops, cardinals, and the pope wear vestments which combine male and female garments. Thus, if Pharaoh was a woman, she wore an artificial beard on state occasions. And the Pharaoh wearing the full regalia of his office. If he was a man, always wore suspended from his back the skin of a lioness, and was referred to as male before and female behind. Thus, the androgynous concept of Pharaoh also early developed within the Egyptian consciousness. Pharaoh as God, therefore, was regarded as having a unique destiny. But this destiny was not generally shared and was reserved for the members of the royal dynasty. For the rest, the Egyptian did not have what we would term any tendency, any pronounced tendency, either to deify his dead or expect from them in another life attributes which they did not possess in this life. During the power of the Scholar Council of the pharaohs in Egypt, there was, however, a magical factor introduced. And in Egyptian religion, there is no essential division between theology and magic, any more than there was an essential division between theology and science. They were considered one body of learning. The Egyptian, because he believed in magical powers, frequently assumed a kind of spiritism. He believed that the dead did not necessarily depart utterly, but if their bodies were returned to the dust and disintegrated, then their contact with the earth was gradually dissolved. The Egyptian dead, in the form of the man-headed hawk, is therefore constantly represented as seated at the foot of the mortuary couch, the soul gazing quietly upon the mummified face of its own body. To assure, therefore, a certain relationship between the living and the dead, the Egyptians developed the process of embalming their heroes, scholars, sages, priests, and great persons, binding them to their body by the perpetuation of that body. The Egyptian believed that he could hold the souls of the dead to the service of Egypt, that they could never fail to be present as long as their bodies were there. This probably underlies the concept of the mummification of the dead. The Christians later embalmed their dead, but this was for another motive, because the early members of the Christian communion believed, literally, that in the second resurrection, or in the resurrection of the dead, the human being would reinvest his body, and that the body should be preserved for this purpose. The Egyptian, however, did not mummify from any such considerations. The dead, consequently, for the most part, particularly in early times, were buried in the knee-chest position, which is called the embryo posture. They were placed in a comparatively circular opening in the ground, sometimes lined with bricks. This knee-chest posture, or embryo position, was to indicate that the deceased person was passing into a kind of second infancy, or was to be reborn in another world. Therefore, that his grave was the embryo of another life, that he was to be born from the earth as from a womb. Not, however, was this birth to be regarded as different, merely in another place. And in this other place, the Egyptian believed firmly that the state of the deceased person would be determined and measured by his earthly condition. If, therefore, he had made certain achievements during his material lifetime, he would continue to enjoy these achievements. If he did not achieve, he would not have the same degree of enjoyment. Later, magic came in again. And so literal did the concept of the afterlife become in the Egyptian consciousness, that it was considered proper, in fact obligatory, to bury with the dead any such belongings, household goods, ornamentations, raiment, and even food that the soul might need in the afterlife. There was a time at which the Egyptians, like many other ancient people, the Chinese, for example, actually believed that the deceased person lived his second life in his own grave. Therefore, his grave was usually a series of rooms or apartments, suitable to supply him with all pleasures and conveniences. The walls were well decorated, not only with pleasant scenery, but with admonitions to morality, virtue, and ethics, so that he might live in the constant sense of improvement. He was supposed to enjoy his afterlife in the same way that he had enjoyed his material estate. Later, the articles buried with the dead were reduced to symbolical equivalents, and it was believed that a tiny image of a servant was just as good as the servant. The Egyptian apparently had already learned to realize that in some mysterious way the utility of these objects depended not upon themselves, but upon the mind of the person who was deceased. If the mind of the dead vitalized these objects, they became useful. If this mind did not vitalize them, they did not become useful. Later, we find the gradual rise of one of the most important cults of Egypt, and that was the rise of the great Osirian cycle, centering around the deity Osiris, who was regarded as the son of Saturn, and held later by the Greeks and Latins to be the equivalent of their Zeus or Jupiter. Osiris, however, combined in one person the attributes of many deities, and a number of later mythologies borrowed phases of these attributes. The philosophy of the Egyptian about Osiris is probably more profound than we realize. And here again we must pause for a second. Let us remember that Egypt was not a savage or untutored land. As we look upon the great architectural monuments of this people, we know that they were learned. We know also that we have a psychological tendency to discredit the learning of the past, or to depreciate anything that might cast a shadow on our own grandeur. But let us face it, the Egyptian was a civilized man. He was a thoughtful man. He had nearly every problem that we know today. We have this from the records. He suffered from high taxes and protective tariffs. He knew very much about debt. He had to borrow money at usurious rates of interest. He recognized property laws. He recognized social obligations. His courts were highly legislated and legalized. His jurists were well trained. His physicians were informed according to the best standards of their times. His scholars were educated. His philosophers were wise and noble. We cannot then assume that a man of this kind, or descent of such men, would over a series of thousands of years affirm the literal acceptance of fables and legends. We must more rightly observe that the sacerdotal mysteries of these people were concealed beneath obligations and oaths. And because they were part of the initiate system of antiquity, they veiled their doctrines in allegories and fables. We have accepted the fables as the facts, and because most of the ancient records are lost, if they were ever committed to writing, which is very doubtful, we have no way of correcting our own perspective. We can only suspect, and perhaps with generosity of spirit acknowledge, that these people must have had religions and philosophies suitable to their estates and reasonable to their attainments. This is true also of Greece, and which is perhaps a more immediate and more pressing example. For we know that Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and Euclid were not foolish, superstitious men, and that the philosophies and theologies which they venerated could not have been merely lore and legendary. In Egypt, therefore, the moment we come upon a great cycle, such as the Osirian cycle, we must begin to parallel it with other comparatively equivalent cycles, such as the great Vedic cycle of India and the Puranas and Bharatas. We can also see in it the theogony of Hesiod and the great epic poems of Homer. We can parallel it with the Bharata, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana, all of the great sagas of the Nordic peoples. These were tremendous accounts of things mysteriously set forth. Osiris in Egypt must then have not only been regarded as a deity by the humble, the uninformed, and the unschooled, but must have stood in the presence of the informed and the enlightened for principles, for realities, which they could comprehend and which their intelligence would demand. We are not therefore surprised to discover that the Egyptians early recognized Osiris as one deity within which a division of deities took place. Isis, Nephthys, Anubis, Typhon, Horus. These deities were not separate from Osiris. They were the very parts and members of himself. So we are able to appreciate why the 42 assessors of the dead in the ritual of the psychostasia are all supposed to have been aspects of the deity himself, the God within whom all these things live and move and have their being, and that gods and godlings are really not separate creatures, but phases or aspects of one creature, one being. And this being for the Egyptian of the Middle Period was Osiris. He recognized Osiris in 4 principal attributes or forms, and these in themselves should tell us that we stand at the gate of a great philosophy. Osiris was first Osiris Ptah, or my Lord the Light. Ptah was the light of the mind and the light of the world. But it was more than intellect. It was the light which enlightened intellect. Therefore, perhaps Osiris Ptah was the Egyptian name or formula or symbol for the term that we call consciousness. Osiris Ptah was a potter. He was a great artificer, and he fashioned all things upon a potter's wheel in the nome of Memphis. Osiris Ptah fashioned first the great age of the world, from which sprang forth both gods and men. Osiris Ptah was also the architect, the base and substance of those archetypal designs which are to be everywhere manifested through creation. Thus, the primary aspect of the deity was consciousness, containing within itself the design of all things, and manifesting that design through the initial action of creation, or as the Egyptians would insist, of generation. Because the Egyptians did not believe in spontaneous creations from nothing. They believed in eternal generations from antecedent causes. This is one of their basic tenets. The second phase of Osiris was Osiris Horus. And here we find the peculiar relationship of father and son. The father who is his own son. The son who is his own father. The son who is the only begotten of the Father. The son who bears witness. The son through whom the Father must be approached. The son who must intercede before the Father for the souls of the righteous dead. Horus, therefore, in the Egyptian symbolism, is certainly a representation of what we call mind. Mind as the firstborn of consciousness. Mind as the eldest creature of reality and truth. Mind as the source of ego, or the existence of selfhood. So that all things in themselves and of themselves are sons of the Father. And that all things partake of this parenthood and bear witness. Thus, Osiris Horus is actually the symbol of the conscious, individualized intellect, which is rooted in universal consciousness and is made ruler over the world. For Osiris so loved his own son that he gave him dominion over all things. This is intellect, or the power of reason, given dominion over the works of consciousness. We know from the ancient manuscripts and from the various appellatives applied to these deities that everything that we have said is actually included among the titles given to these deities. Therefore, we are not exaggerating. Horus, among his titles, includes the only begotten of Osiris. Also, another title is the firstborn of eternity. Another title of him is he who shall bear witness. Another title of him is the Redeemer. Still another, the Intercessor. He is also called the Bridge and the Door. And it is said of him that he guards the house of his Father. By the time you add maybe 100 or 200 of these appellatives together, you begin to get a fairly accurate concept of what the Egyptian was attempting to convey. The third aspect of Osiris was called Osiris Lunist, and he is represented, ornamented, and adorned with the lunar crescent. Osiris Luna was worshipped as the nocturnal sun, or the son of the night. And from the terms and appellatives again, we find that he is the lord of the astral light and presides over the mystery of imagination. He is therefore Osiris of desire, Osiris the beloved. He is the one who emerges as the great dreamer, the one whose dreams are always true. He represents the entire internal, subjective, psychological life of both man and the universe. He is the Osiris of hope, of faith, and of the great desire. He is the Osiris who rejoices in the music of the sistrum. He is the Osiris of drama, who wears the masks of many faces. He is the Osiris who moves with the spring and brings forth the harvest. He is the Osiris who is the spirit of growth. He is also the one who giveth his beloved sleep, so that those in their dreams may come to him. He is strangely a mystical deity, a